My name is Michael Baker. I'm on the Board of Governors of the Commonwealth Club and also the head of the East Bay chapter of the Commonwealth Club, where we're having the same lecture tonight. Thank you all for joining us. The first thing I'm going to ask you to do is to silence your cell phones and to make sure that we don't have any extraneous interruptions. And thank you all for coming. Just for fun, how many of you are actually members of the Commonwealth Club? Well, I'm impressed. I don't have to give you the pitch about giving the gift of membership, although you might want to give it to other members of your family, particularly the young ones, so we can get them involved, because that's really important for our future. And I see a couple people who are a little younger hiding in the back row, and if you guys want to come up here, otherwise I'm going to have to call on you. So thank you for coming today. We're going to have a very interesting and exciting lecture from a real expert, Dr. Alexander Vindman, a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel who is the Director for European Affairs on the National Security Council. Before that, he was the Political Military Affairs Officer for Russia for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and there he authored the National Military Strategy for Russia. So he knows a lot about what's going on in that part of the world. He was also an attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine, in Kyiv, and also he was at the embassy in Moscow. So he's had experiences in both countries, speaks both languages, knows this part of the world well. Among the other things, you can read about all his academic achievements and stuff that we posted online, but I'm just going to point out that he has a Purple Heart for injuries sustained in Iraq during combat. He has a Combat Infantryman's Badge, which he earned at great risk to his own life serving his country. And he wears a Ranger tab. And you don't get that very easy. So, he's got a lot of things in addition to being a scholar, being a soldier, doing the things he's doing. He got a master's from Harvard. He served as a Hauser leader, and then he got a master's and a doctorate from Johns Hopkins, which is why I refer to him as Dr. Vindman now. And but what I want to do now is, just because we're all here, I want to show you a video clip, real short, it's a minute, of why I admire him so much and why I'm his biggest fan, and I've been his biggest fan ever since I saw him do this particular event. So if we could roll the video.
You realize when you came forward out of sense of duty that you were putting yourself in direct opposition to the most powerful person in the world. Do you realize that, sir?
I knew I was assuming a lot of risk.
And I'm struck by that word, don't worry, that phrase, do not worry, you addressed to your dad. Was your dad a warrior?
He did serve. It was a different military, though.
And he would have worried if you were putting yourself up against the President of the United States, is that right?
He deeply worried about it because in his context, there was the ultimate risk.
And why do you have confidence that you can do that and tell your dad not to worry?
Congressman, because this is America. This is the country I've served and defended, that all of my brothers have served, and here, right matters.
Thank you, sir. Yield back.
So let me bring out Colonel Vindman and Dr. Vindman, and now you know why I'm a big fan. Thank you. A little surprise for you.
Thank you. Thank you. So Admiral Baker knows I tend to be quite informal, and we'll keep this conversation also informal. We'll cover the topic of how the United States can advance its interests without abandoning its core values. I'll tell you a little bit about what I've been up to in the intervening years. We'll talk about this book and both a diagnosis of where we went wrong as well as a prescription to go forward. And frankly, I want to spend some time talking about current events because there are a lot of events just shockingly. I mean, it's a parade of disasters and chaos. Yesterday, the administration released a national security strategy. Today, there was a revelation that the Trump administration has informed the Europeans that the U.S. will not be I guess, the cornerstone of European security, have a force presence in Europe, and it has a lot of dangerous implications for for the U.S. I mean, it's not about the European security. It's that's important. There are allies. There's a kind of a humanistic component to having these long-term relationships, but U.S. national security is endangered. I want to thank the Commonwealth Club and Admiral Baker. I've gotten a chance to know him for over the course of several years, actually, at this point. I've been working with a group called Vote Vets, helping, doing a bunch of different things, national security, national defense policy, but also helping get veterans elected, and he's been a terrific supporter on that front. And as a doc, he's traveled over to Ukraine a bunch of times, pitched in, put his own skin in the game. So really appreciate his career of service, and supposedly he's retired, but it doesn't sound like it. He's still quite busy. So thanks again for having me come out here today for a couple of different events. So maybe a little bit of catch up on, after this moment where I testified. It's a little awkward standing in front of this like acrylic thing over here. But so maybe I'll move around a little bit. So after testifying in front of Congress, I still thought I may have had a military career. I thought that somehow maybe a little bit of naivete, that having done the right thing, built years of relationships with the military, with senior commanders, that somehow that was going to allow me to be a little bit insulated and weather what was certainly going to be a storm. That was misplaced. I think the fact is that nobody is even to this day, I think nobody's quite ready for the Trump effect and how disastrous that is. So I stuck around for a while. I tried to force the Army to do the right thing, which is not the easiest thing to do, to get the institution to do the right thing. I knew that I was on the promotion list for colonel, and I was going to hold them to that. But they waited me out. They delayed my promotion for about 5 months or so. Hundreds of the folks I grew up in the military with, hundreds of those folks were waiting for their announcement on whether they still had a military career, whether they were going to be promoted or let go. And I kind of ended up becoming like the butt of jokes. So, well, it's Vindman that's holding up the promotion list. I mean, nobody was really giving me a hard time, but that's what was happening. And on the very, very last day that I could actually leave, everything is kind of very rigid and formulaic in the military. On the very last day I could leave, so the process is, I was instructed to go, I hadn't been, the promotion hadn't been announced yet, but I was instructed to go to the Army War College, which is a senior kind of rite of passage for advancement to colonel and potential general officer. And you have 30 days to decide. And if you want to leave the military, you let them know, and then you could leave. If you don't let them know within those 30 days, then the military does with you as they please. You have to continue on with your orders. And that would have been obligated to do 3 years. And this was in a moment where the Trump administration looked like it still had its wind in its sails. Biden hadn't taken off. He wouldn't take off for many, many months. Not until South Carolina, a year on or so. And I just decided I was going to take my future into my own hands and leave. And on my first day out of uniform, I wrote a kind of a manifesto for myself in the Washington Post. I talked about the fact that I wasn't done with service. My plan was to continue to advocate for public service, to advocate for values-based leadership, which is something that I get to do with the Vote Vets, help get veterans elected that will live up to their oaths, and advance the U.S. national security. So that's what I've been doing for the intervening, I guess, 5 years, 5.5 years or so. Various academic positions, think tank positions. I run my own think tank inside this organization, this Vote Vets organization. And then, so going around the country, trying to educate folks, answer their questions on what is going on in the world, be a translator on all these different events and what they really mean, not just kind of superficially, but you dig below the surface and how they're being viewed by our adversaries. So that's, I guess, for those that are not familiar, that's a catch up on where we are. Amongst the different things I've undertaken was this second book that we'll have a chance to talk about, and I'll do some. I'll happy to sign those on the back end. That was my doctoral dissertation. I wanted to dive into this topic of how things went awry on the back end of the Cold War, when there was an enormous amount of hope as to how the world could unfold. Russia potentially could be a member of pan-European security, a contributor to global stability and security. What went wrong in this Russia-U.S.-Ukraine relationship? And in the military, you don't diagnose problems without proposing solutions. So I take a chop at trying to propose some solutions also. Very, very different than what this administration is undertaking. So this was a study of 30 plus years of relationships across 6 different administrations, Republican, Democratic administrations, some consistencies on what went wrong along the way. In order to tell that story over the past 35 years, adding the context of what are these narratives if you scratch the surface of what Putin is talking about, what are these narratives that he's talking about? That Ukraine isn't a real country, it doesn't really, it shouldn't be a sovereign independent state, that the Russian Ukrainian people are one and the same, all these types of things. So I go further back. I try to cover in about 1,000, in one chapter, about 1,000 years of history, and then jump forward and dive deeper into the Soviet period, the 20th century, and then what occurred over the course of the last 35 years. So some conclusions, I guess. The structure is, and the format was to interview decision makers, principal decision makers on the U.S. side, on the Ukrainian side. The Russian side, I really didn't need access to as much. I was pretty well versed with what they were thinking along the way. And in interviewing presidents on down, I wanted to kind of get their thinking about the decisions they made at independence. When the Soviet Union fell apart, Ukraine voted overwhelmingly. Actually, was it yesterday or 2 days ago, the anniversary of Ukraine's vote, where they overwhelmingly voted 92% of the entirety of the population. 92% they got 92% of a population to agree on one thing, that Ukraine shouldn't be part of the Soviet Union. And that tells you a little bit about the deeper story, that this wasn't a decision about what happened that day or that week or that year or that decade or that century, but this was something that had been unfolding over the course of multiple centuries, with Ukraine fighting for its independence. So that was one of the moments I take a look at. I take a look at denuclearization, what occurred with regards to this concerted pressure between Russia and the U.S. collaboratively. So we partnered up with the Russians initially to figure out how to put the squeeze on Ukraine to get them to give up their nuclear weapons. The earliest part of that phase was the Russians playing that role of the domineering older brother or whatever the case might be, putting the squeeze on the Ukrainians. Didn't work. Ultimately, we started trilateral talks where the U.S. was brought into that conversation because the Russians couldn't get across the goal line. But even the U.S. involvement wasn't enough to just put the squeeze on them. We had to change our approach to Ukraine because they needed to figure out how to secure their sovereignty. They needed to figure out how they undertake this massive transition from a planned economy to a market economy, how they transition from an authoritarian regime to a democratic regime. And this, they needed that kind of support when they achieved some level of confidence that they could get as much as they could, and along with their own internal recognition that they couldn't maintain a nuclear arsenal without costs, without political costs, without being a pariah, as well as a recognition that it would be cost prohibitive when this country is in transition. They agreed to sign on to the Budapest Accords and how that unfolded. And then I take a look at the Orange Revolution, the first revolution that the Ukrainians conducted, and when after Russia graduating from just typical basic coercion, the same thing it kind of did in other corners of the former Soviet Empire, went to hybrid warfare and started to try to interfere in Ukraine's elections, putting massive resources behind their preferred candidate. And the Ukrainian population rebelled against that notion, showed up in the streets to the tune of millions, and that resulted in a new election and a new pro-democratic leader coming in. And then I take a look at the Georgia invasion by Russia, the Russia-Georgia war, and the decisions around the invitation to invite Ukraine into NATO, and how those were fitful. I mean, there are chapters on each one of these things, so I'm giving you the wave tops here, why we took these actions. And then same thing with the war starting in 2014, how Russia kind of got a slap on the wrist, after 2022, even the Biden administration, with a clearer kind of calculated, better understanding of what was going on, was still subject to the same thing that affected all of these administrations. Buying into Russian exceptionalism, that Russia deserved a unique and singular treatment in the world, that Russia, because it was the largest country in the world, because it had a massive nuclear arsenal, because we bought into their idea of, they could flex their muscles with regards to their military, the artifacts of the Soviet Union and the role that Russia was able to play with regards to UN Security Council and other international institutions. We bought into this exceptionalism. We weren't critical enough. We were, very not accommodating, very gracious victors. When we could have been more conditional. Because we took this approach, Russia was able to play on, and Putin in particular, if, the 1990s offered some rationale to be forgiving, to try to bring Russia into the fold, by the time you get to the 2000s, things unravel pretty quickly, and we became subject to misplaced hopes and misplaced fears. So what does that mean? Misplaced hopes that Russia was still going to be a net contributor, that instead of playing an arresting role on the war in the Balkans, that Russia was actually nurturing some of the genocide that was occurring there, or that Russia was undertaking in the Second Chechen War, if we remember that far back, that Russia was brutal and barbaric in suppressing its population. The fact that Russia was rooting out these nascent democratic institutions like free speech, independent media, free and fair elections, that we could have been far more conditional, but we succumbed to misplaced hopes. Do I dismiss some of the things that we managed to achieve? I think one of the most notable ones was of course some of the arms control agreements like New START being signed. But by and large, a lot of these other things didn't warrant our attention, didn't warrant us sacrificing our interests for European stability for the long term. And in that direction, what is an example? Climate change. The Russians really could care less about climate change, but they knew it was important to previous U.S. administrations, so they would dangle that in front of us. Or the perfect example, George Bush II meeting with Putin at his ranch in Crawford, Texas, saying that he looked into Putin's eyes and saw a soul. What was he playing at there? He thought that somehow that the Russians would be partners in rooting out international terrorism after the 9/11 attacks. So that's one part of the equation. Misplaced hopes. The other one is misplaced fears. That if we were in fact more conditional, if we signaled to Russia that their transgressions would come with costs, if we were more robust in our support of other important democracies like Ukraine. In my interviews with both Bill Clinton and Al Gore, they both said that we needed to be successful in Russia and Ukraine, or Russia or Ukraine. And ultimately, we were successful in neither because of this fear component, that somehow in bolstering democratic institutions, democratic states, that was going to undermine any possibility to achieve some successes with Russia. I think that was the wrong conclusion to draw, primarily because the Russians require this kind of clarity. They would have never went into a war in 2014 or 2022 if they knew the costs were going to be this high, that the world in a lot of ways, especially in the early days, was going to rally around Ukraine. So, the bottom line is we succumb to misplaced hopes and misplaced fears. That's the continuous thread that I talk about in the book. It has some interesting color, some high adventures. Being an attaché in Russia and Ukraine is not a typical assignment. I was assigned to the embassy in Moscow after spending a year in Ukraine, after finishing up my master's at Harvard, after traveling throughout the region, and this was the World Series, basically, and under constant scrutiny by the Russian security services, their efforts to try to trip up, undermine, impede all the different activities. And nevertheless, we still had a job to do, a critical job to do. My higher headquarters, nothing classified here, was the Defense Intelligence Agency. My job was to observe and report, and in that I talk about a couple of the, different activities, including patrolling the Russian-Ukrainian border on the Russian side, and with the Russians trying to run me off the road at one point. So it's not completely a dry. It's not like my first book, which was a memoir, but it's also not just purely policy or history, diplomatic history. It's also my own kind of observations and experiences along the way. I think, let me see if there's anything else to hit on this side. Let's actually, before we move on to current events. So what if that's the problem, what is the solution? The title of the book is The Folly of Realism. The subtitle is self-explanatory, how the West deceived itself about Russia and betrayed Ukraine. But what is realism and what is the folly? Realism, fundamentally, if you take it down to a bumper sticker, maybe an oversimplification, it's basically this idea that states pursue their individual interests and pursue them maximally. So what does that mean? That means everything is a transaction. It means everything is basically what's immediately in front of you. And nobody represents the folly of realism better than Donald Trump. This is a person that doesn't understand the context of the relationships. What our troops bled for and died for in World War II to usher in a period of enormous, in spite of all the challenges, of enormous prosperity and stability. We had a Cold War, but we managed to avoid massive interstate wars. And he doesn't understand that, what we were buying ourselves with that sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of Americans. He doesn't understand that the sources of U.S. prosperity and security are our relationships with the Europeans. They are the bedrock of our security, the collective defense of NATO and Article 5. The one single time that NATO Article 5 was invoked was after the U.S. was attacked. But this has been a warning to any comers that you don't just face the massive power of the United States, you face the collective power of 40+% of the world's gross domestic product, an enormous component of the defense expenditure of the world. He doesn't understand that the reason that the U.S. is as prosperous as it was is that we took on a pluralistic notion that it's not just about the U.S. maximizing its benefits, but a pluralistic notion, this idea of a rising tide raises all boats, and this idea that, if we are the reserve currency, that we could print as much money as we want, just about, frankly, and people will still invest in us, and that our economy can grow. He doesn't understand these things. So everything becomes a transaction. We'll talk about this in a second, but this national security strategy, which is pretty frightening, is an interesting place to look on his worldview. he thinks that, maybe the best thing to do is to engage some of these, buying into Russian exceptionalism, engage with Russia and figure out if there were just deals that could be done. Real estate deals, cryptocurrency deals, same thing with the Middle East, same thing with China. So no context. And if you have no context on what's going on around the world, then you just do a pecking order of what are the biggest economies, who are the biggest players, where's the biggest gain for a transaction, and that's where you get a folly of realism. Now, what's happened, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the state of the war in Russia and Ukraine, but before we get there, what's happened over the course of the past 24, 48 hours, shockingly, is that the U.S. released a national security strategy. It is, it basically, on paper, explains a lot of my very, very deep concerns about the direction this country has taken. And it's this idea that only the big states matter. It's a very kind of antiquated 19th century view. They list ideas like balance of power. How do you manage the other rising powers that could be a threat? It's this basic idea that, as the folly of realism prescribes, that there are only a small number of states. It's Russia, it's China, and the U.S., and they basically carve up the world into spheres of influence and to rule the jungle, so the strong could prey on the weak. So that's part of this challenge, the part of this folly. The other part of this is, if this is a massive amplification of all the mistakes that we've made over the course of the past 30 plus years. Some presidents performed better than others. Biden, I think, he gets pretty decent marks, certainly on building democratic unity and support for Ukraine. Falls well short on recognizing that Putin could have been warned off potentially from this war. Ukraine could have been bolstered into a much, much more successful position while Russia is off balance, but the fears were of escalation into a direct confrontation. Happy to take questions on why that's not going to be the case. So if this is the case, now we had this kind of consistent pattern and now amplified under Trump, what's the alternative? So I talk about this idea of neo-idealism. I talk about this idea of not as a kind of a ideological or idealistic approach, but if we know that realism is transactional, what gets us back to something that's more long-sighted, focuses on what really matters. And I propose this idea of values primacy. What is the source of identify the source of our strength and security and prosperity, and that neo-idealism, if we put values first, not sacrificing all of our interests entirely, but we put values first, that allows us to focus in on what matters over the long term. Something that we actually will need to do. We will absolutely need to do this approach on the back end of a Trump administration because it has discarded all values. And if we want to reclaim our moral standing, our moral leadership in the world, we're going to have to advocate a vision that brings democracies together. So I think there's right now we're in the worst place we could be with regards to realizing my vision of values primacy and neo-idealism. But I think we have a natural opportunity to do this because one factor for other Europeans that are now going to be going it alone is a recognition that together we could do a lot more on pushing back on authoritarianism. But in order to do something together, the U.S. is going to have to signal that this is a hard pivot away from Trump. So I think there's going to be a moment for neo-idealism. The other thing, just coming back to the national security strategy that was released, there is now significant reporting that the Trump administration intends to looks like they intend to withdraw troops from Europe, a place that we've had troops. We have troops around the world. It gives us access. It gives us abilities to respond to different contingencies. They're not there, to police those states that they're based in, but they're there for crisis. They're there for to warn off Russia and Russian aggression, for instance. And the president looks like he wants to withdraw U.S. presence and has declared that the U.S. won't be, kind of a central player in European security, which even today, he said this is going to happen by 2027. Even today, the signal to the Russians is that the U.S. will not be there in the case of an attack on Europe. And even today, it's the clearest signal possible that the Russians could start mucking around in Europe immediately with little to no cost. So it's a pretty dangerous situation. So let's talk about the dynamics on the battlefield in Ukraine for a little bit. We've gone through different phases in this confrontation. Certainly, the consensus from the U.S. intelligence community was that Ukraine was not going to last very long. Some of the more optimistic scenarios were that if the state falls, there'd still be massive guerrilla warfare, some insurgency operations to resist Russia, but the state wouldn't last. Putin also obviously shared this view, an enormous amount of war optimism, war euphoria that this was going to be a 3-year war. Obviously didn't play out that way, and the Ukrainians have held their own. We're coming up on the 4-year anniversary of the war, and we're seeing a situation in which Russia continues, in spite of massive losses, continues to make up some small bit of ground. But does that mean that Russia's winning? And to me, the conclusion is pretty clear. It's not. At this pace of advance, unless the Ukrainians break and the military and the resistance collapses, the Russians have no chances of achieving even their kind of more publicly limited gains, which is this control of these 4 regions that Russia has attempted to annex, let alone the real objective that Putin talks about to his own population, which is Ukraine is a failed state, Russia exercising dominating the region, dominating Ukraine, and in this scenario, Russia's made a major stride towards rebuilding its empire. This is something akin to the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. So we're way, way away from that. There are enormous risks in the way this is unfolding. Under the Biden administration, we were a day late and a dollar short. We are providing no support to Ukraine directly in terms of presidential drawdown. Everything that they get now is either they're buying or the Europeans are buying on their behalf. That is the Europeans floating the entirety of the war effort. So the external support to Ukraine is absolutely central to Ukraine being able to exit this war in a somewhat healthy situation where the state, might not be able to regain all the territory lost, but it's still a viable state. Still has access to a lot of the resources, the territory, the human capital, the population, in order to be a functional state. So the conditions for Russia are a economy and stretched extremely thin. So think about it as a extremely taut rubber band. They've absorbed all of the shocks they can easily absorb. Anything major at this point, additional sanctions are going to start to have a more significant effect on inflation, on the ability of the Russian government to meet its obligations, and it's going to be increasingly costly. So we're in a situation in which both sides are under stress. The Ukrainians are really, really thin on manpower, makes it hard to fight a war. They're making up for some of those difficulties with regard to innovation and drone warfare, something that we didn't see in any major, wasn't a factor before this war in any significant kind of way. Certainly the U.S. wasn't employing drones in anything resembling what we have today. So we have a situation in which this war is likely to continue on, I think, through another year. I think the encouragement from the Trump administration explicitly as well as implicitly. So explicitly with these peace negotiations and the willingness to do deals that sacrifice Ukraine. what I've been referring to as the dimwit peace plan. Those things are explicit encouragement, but implicitly also that that Trump is a chaos agent driving wedges with regards to NATO. All these things point to encouraging Putin to stick around, even under stress, even with significant losses. So that means that the Europeans, the U.S. is absent, non-factor. Really, to a certain extent, except for putting the squeeze on the Ukrainians. So the Europeans are going to have to pick up the slack, which they can do. They're 10 times the size of the Russian economy. They have a massive industrial base. It's thin. It's atrophied. It has been underinvested in for a long time, but they're starting to make up for it. And the Ukrainians can start to do with your more robust European support, they could start to make up for some of the challenges that they have with regards to manpower, and maybe even take some necessary steps to recruit younger folks. Their draft starts at 25 because they're trying to preserve the 18 to 25 age group as the future of their nation society. But they might have to dig a little deeper, unfortunately, for this existential war. So. I'm trying to think if there's anything else before we move to questions. Let me see. That was all really without looking at my notes. Yeah, I think maybe the last thing I'll mention is a step back in a kind of a bigger view of the world. So I think to me it's increasingly clear that the struggle for at least the first half of the 21st century is going to be between authoritarianism and what my friend Mike McFaul refers to as the autocrats versus the Democrats, authoritarianism versus despotism, and authoritarianism versus democracy. So where does that leave us? It leaves for the next 3 years, the U.S. is going to be, it's not going to be a bulwark against the surging authoritarianism. It's going to be potentially a partisan for authoritarian regimes. The national security strategy explicitly actually says something about attacking is not too strong a word. Attacking the Europeans for advocating for their liberal Western democratic values, and giving and explicitly talks about this idea of giving authoritarian regimes a pass. Flexible, they call it flexible realism. So it's an interesting idea that we're starting off. We're year 25 in this century, and the U.S. is instead of recognizing that this is this existential threat, this ideological struggle between Democrats and autocrats, that the U.S. is playing a supporting role for the autocrats. On the back end, maybe this is a little bit of optimism, but on the back end, I think that I'm seeing signals internally in the U.S. of the population of waking up to the dangers. I travel a lot around the United States. My organization, Vote Vets, is involved in scores and scores of different elections. Those two gubernatorials in Virginia and New Jersey, that was a Vote Vets project. Those were Vote Vets candidates that were elected, and we put massive resources into their campaigns. And in doing this kind of what amounts to survey work, it's clear to me that more and more of the U.S. population is shaking off its apathy and complacency. So we are in a situation in which, years from now, after we get past the Trump administration, and the U.S. is looking to actually play a constructive role in this struggle between the ideological struggle between Democrats and autocrats, we will have an opportunity to rebuild bridges with our much more skeptical European allies and democracies, but in a way that allows us to actually get in this fight and not cede ground. In the meantime, Lots of challenges on the horizon. The Russians are almost certainly going to be more aggressive. They're already quite aggressive with regards to hybrid warfare, sabotage operations, murders. I'm not sure if it's surprisingly it wasn't carried that much, but it looks like it was a Russian operation to try to shoot down President Zelensky's aircraft off the coast of Ireland just within the earlier this week. So those kinds of operations. The Chinese, I think, are particularly a dangerous adversary because they are not a small economy. They're not the monolith that they're often put up to be, nor is it entirely clear that we are destined for a confrontation. But we have to be prepared for a much more kind of hostile relationship. And in that regard, sending ambiguous signals about what we'll do with regards to Taiwan, China's seizure of Taiwan, going to being equivocal in our support for Ukraine or Europe, emboldens the Chinese. So we are headed to a particularly dangerous place in the Western Hemisphere. Another thing I'll point out, because it's fresh in mind, the national security strategy talks about the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, is what they refer to it. So it's this idea that the U.S. owns the Western Hemisphere, burning a lot of bridges in our own backyard. We might get involved in I think there's a reasonable chance we get into a shooting war with Venezuela. And that's the condition for the next 3 years. On the back end, some opportunities to rebuild domestically, but we have challenges ahead. So with that, why don't we move to questions?
I'm going to invoke the right of the host to ask the first question, which is, how did an ill-prepared and ill-equipped Ukrainian military that was going to fall in a week, supposedly, hold off the second largest army in the world with all their equipment?
It's a super interesting story, and eventually it will make for a superb documentary as well as like a cinematic thing with the Ukrainians defending their country. I'm waiting for that movie to be made. But I think there are a couple different factors here. I'd say one of the major factors was the fact that the Russians have this deep chauvinism, that Russia is mighty, superior. There's a pejorative that they refer to the Ukrainians as chachol, basically like rednecks, country bumpkins, and stuff like that. So they were very dismissive of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were fighting for their families, for their children, for future generations. This is a war that's been going on. Whether it was hot or not, this is a struggle that the Ukrainians have been undertaking for centuries, for their sovereignty and independence. It's an important aspect of the story I talk about in the book. So that was, the morale and the fighting for their homes was pretty central. It's also important to understand that the Ukrainian military, sometimes we're pretty critical of it, and it makes, I think it's partially justified that the story is that, a small Soviet military doesn't beat a large Soviet military, is the criticism that you get about Ukraine, that there still hasn't quite adjusted to being a Western military. But the reality is actually much more complex than that. The U.S. has been working with Ukraine for in earnest, really, since 2014. We could have been doing a lot more, but we were still undertaking significant training operations, training exercises with the Ukrainians, and land, sea, and air to a certain extent, to allow them to modernize and become much more effective. And when the Russians came in, they thought that they were fighting a military that was going to crumble immediately. That didn't happen. The Ukrainians were exceptionally effective at small unit tactics, in particular, just crushing the Russians with relatively modest raids. The Ukrainians were prepared to deal with Russia's air superiority and conducting a bunch of ambushes where the Russians weren't able to get air dominance. All these factors came together to allow Ukraine to win the Battle of Kiev, win the Battle of Kharkiv, and now Russia's fighting for tiny slivers of land when they had at one point 40% of the Ukrainian territory that they were occupying. They're now less than 20% of the territory. So, but those gains and reversals occurred very, very quickly. These are two completely different militaries now, in certain regards. The Russians also have been adapting and learning, and they're far, far more effective than they were at the beginning of the war. They're producing more drones than the Ukrainians are right now, and it's definitely a very, very challenging fight from here forward. But yeah, that's the story, I guess, the quick story.
Okay. Maybe throw in a little bit of Russian corruption and alcoholism and a few other things that made their army crumble.
Yeah, supposedly about 40% of what is spent is squandered in graft. So
just like in our White House. Sorry. Okay, next question. On a scale, thank you for that answer, by the way. On a scale of 1 to 10, what number would you assign to President Zelensky for his leadership and governance since the invasion?
It's. I mean, these are all multifaceted individuals. I'd say he gets. Oftentimes, he might get a 10 for rallying the country, rallying the international community. He might get a 6 for being the commander-in-chief and sometimes being overly involved in the military operations, looking for political wins that undermine the war effort and, encourage or drive the Ukrainian military to take foolish operations like they did defending the city of Bakhmut, which squandered resources, or their invasion of Russia for some months. But maybe lower scores there. Was quite weak on fighting out corruption and rooting out, entrenched interests in the early days. He's gotten better. He's now dealing with a major corruption scandal. I wish we were dealing with some of these corruption scandals maybe as effectively, where the number 2 guy in the country, his chief of staff, was forced to resign. So far, we haven't had any resignations on, frankly, in a lot of ways, maybe a more corrupt. Strangely, it's hard to wrap your mind around this issue because corruption is one of the. If Ukraine fails as a state, there's 2 factors: Russian aggression and Ukrainian corruption, and it's hard to wrap my mind around the fact that we're in the world in which the Trump administration may be undertaking even more robust corruption, and there is no consequence for it.
Yeah, certainly the dollar numbers are bigger.
Yeah.
The other part of that question is, has President Trump been compromised by the Russians? You don't have to answer that if you think there's any risk.
Yeah. No, I mean, compromised is an interesting way to put it. The various ways that this is phrased is like, what do the Russians have on him? Is he a Russian agent and things of that nature? Is he compromised? He's compromised absolutely, in that he thinks that there are deals to be made and that he could enrich himself. So in that regard, he's compromised. He is a combination of these are technical terms. What are the intelligence community, when you assess as an intelligence officer, as you assess sources, potential sources, and try to develop agents, you think about, like, can this person be used as a useful idiot? Trump is a useful idiot. You could manipulate him based on his deep character flaws and pander to him, and Trump is getting effectively manipulated by Europeans at times too, that come to him and talk to him about, like, I think the Secretary General of NATO called him daddy or something like that at one point. So those types of things are kind of effective to manipulate him as a useful idiot. He's also a fellow traveler, which is another term in which somebody that believes, like, in this idea of power residing in China, the U.S., and Russia. He shares that same view with Putin and Xi. So in that regard, he could be manipulated in that regard. So I think there are ways that he's obviously being manipulated, exploited. The idea of whether there's like dirt, whether there are tapes of him in Russia, I don't think the Russians would have to employ him in that regard. They have much easier access to him for these other things.
Great question. Thank you. Some of these are two parts. The first one is we've noticed lately that Putin's been wearing his military uniform at almost every public appearance. Does that indicate anything to you about his thinking of what he's doing next in terms of aggression?
I don't know if I actually didn't really take note of it. I've seen him wear this quasi, but so for in Russia, even the civilian leadership still has what look like military uniforms. The Minister of Defense will wear like a marshal's uniform with a big marshal star, or what looks like a marshal star, on his epaulets. It is just kind of the nature of authoritarian regimes, same thing that you see, in other regimes where they both signal that they're the commander-in-chief and the top military official. I think the question might be, what are his next steps, separate and apart from this issue of uniform? I think his next steps are to take these gifts, take these signals from Trump, and take action on them. And I think that, we've seen this play out over the course of months, where the Russians have been at times more adventurous in Europe, whether it's planes flying over Estonia, drones flying over Poland, and things of that nature. And now, there's a doctrine where the Europeans will shoot them down. But because there's a clearer wedge between the U.S. and Europe, and NATO looks fractured, the question is how to exploit those. Because one of the most important objectives Putin has had is, yes, it's about subduing Ukraine and rebuilding empire. But it's also about a means to be able to exert much greater influence in Europe. And he could do that in a world in which NATO doesn't exist, and that he could basically put the squeeze on smaller states. And that being one of the most important objectives he's going to look to figure out how to break NATO.
Great, thank you. A lot of good questions. So the Institute of War says that well over 1 million Russian casualties have been sustained, along with tremendous loss of equipment and stuff. I realize he doesn't have to run for re-election, but doesn't anybody in Russia care? 1 million casualties is a lot of casualties.
Yeah, I'm not sure if, some folks care. By and large, this war is not deeply unpopular. There is not, part of this is the fact that Putin actually has enormous repressive tools that he actually hasn't even had to tap. He did that a little bit in the opening weeks and months of the war. He was able to successfully suppress some small number of protests. But since then, he hasn't really had to repress that much. Anytime anybody pipes up in any kind of critical way, even holding, it gets to the point where somebody's holding a blank piece of paper, but it's taken as a protest, and that's enough to get you arrested and tried. So it's hard to entirely see the picture on the popularity of this war, but I think there is definitely the 1 million plus casualties, killed and wounded, is not sufficient to drive popular unrest. I think there are segments of the society that are prospering and benefiting. So that's the military-industrial sector. It's the source of Russia's growth right now. It's why it has still plus. If you excluded the defense sector, it would be in a deep recession already. But the defense spending has floated the economy. I think that the money that the Russians have been offering to contract soldiers is life-changing sums. So we're talking about, buying a house, buying a car for the signing bonuses and things of that nature. So it makes this war not deeply unpopular on that basis. So maybe the part of this question of whether there's any kind of threat to stability or domestic unrest that's going to drive Putin to, to warn Putin off or continue to prosecute this war, I don't think so. And that's why I think that if the U.S. were to render more support, if the Europeans were to render more support, if there were heavier sanctions, and Putin thought that he couldn't, there was no benefit in continuing, I think he has actually quite a lot of latitude in terms of ending this war if he wanted to, without suffering an enormous amount of risk. So if we think about this from the standpoint that these are not deep threats to his regime, that those consequences would unfold, years down the road, then he actually has a lot of latitude if he's convinced that this war is too costly and there's no benefit.
Interesting. So 2 questions about Putin's health. What happens if Putin dies? And if so, who might be the next person to step up in Russia to take control, and what might their plan be?
So this is the other side of this is the other part of that question. Is there a dynamic that results in regime change? One of them would be popular unrest. The other one is, he dies or there's a coup. Again, extremely low probability of that. I think the fact is that, the benefits that the elites have, they have them as a result of being participants in the system. Even if their world is shrunk and they have less access to Europe and other corners of the world, they're still they're princes in Russia, exercising massive power. I don't think that Putin. There's speculation about like back issues and health issues, but I think that's all it is. It's speculation. I remember serving in Moscow. A guy would disappear for a week, and there would be speculation that he's like on death's door or something like that. So I'm very, very skeptical about these ideas. But I think the most likely scenario is that the consequences of this war unfold over the course of years in the aftermath of any ceasefire or peace, and that he'll have to explain in a different context what was the benefit of waging this extremely costly war. I think the base case is that his current term doesn't expire until 2030. He actually constitutionally is able to stick around until 2036. And let me do the math here. That would put him at 2036. He was born in 52. So whatever that math is. So 70, so it'd be just about, 84, right? Sorry. I hate doing public math. That is pretty old for Russian men. I mean, the median age is not anywhere near that high. I think that beyond 2036 is then there's a conversation as we approach that number of somebody else stepping in to take that role. There is no incentive for Putin to start to develop somebody to take a spot that far out. I think that's something that will unfold, much deeper. If it's not an acute change that occurs over, several years out from now. So we don't know who that figure is. It would be just rampant speculation on which one of the inner circle at this point would be able to survive that long and inherent. But it's more than likely going to be, there's a couple things that can be said about this, actually. It's going to be somebody that almost certainly, again, unlikely that there's a regime change. So it's going to be a more orderly transition. In that kind of scenario, it's going to be somebody like Putin that was put in place by Yeltsin to be able to protect the outgoing regime. So we know that much is more than likely. And the other thing that's very clear is it's not going to be somebody that exercises power the way Putin does. So if Putin has been the head of his country for 25 years, and say 30 years, or maybe even 36 years, which is an enormously long amount of time, the person that comes in behind him is going to be in a much more difficult situation, trying to figure out how to navigate these factions, how to balance these factions, and I think that's the person that is going to be more vulnerable to something closer to regime change or a revolution that takes Russia in a different direction.
Interesting. So who actually is managing U.S. foreign affairs today, such as writing that national security strategy, knowing what we know about the White House?
Okay, so I think it's whoever wrote that was schizophrenic, ADD high schooler wrote the national security strategy.
Don't insult our high school kids in the back.
Okay, we're not talking about anybody here, but it could have easily been. I don't think an AI would have produced that document. It would probably have produced something a little bit more coherent and not going into so many different directions. What do we? This administration, the leadership, we don't have a national security advisor. We have the Secretary of State that's dual-hatted as the National Security Advisor. So he's filling both roles. It's the role of the National Security Advisor to undertake, this very, very robust effort to write a national security strategy that identifies the ends, what are the objectives, what are we trying to achieve, the ways and the means, the ways that we get there, and the resources we could apply. This doesn't have any of that, really. This is a very ideological. It starts off with lots of grievances. It talks about, woke. It talks about, immigration, or immigrants, doing harm. All sorts of pretty absurd ideas that would never have made it into any rational national security strategy. So I don't think we have a coherent process here. More than likely, it was a small number of folks that took a look at various drafts of this thing, and then added the words that would be pleasing to Trump, like about ending multiple wars and being the peace president and all that kind of stuff. We don't have a functioning process. We have a bunch of personalities of loyal Trump henchmen that have their fiefdoms. They come together, have maybe sometimes agree on things, but usually go off in their own directions and act in their own self-interest, as with one kind of guiding rule is don't piss off the boss. Steal what you want, but don't steal more than the boss, or don't piss off the boss. So it is, that's the first year, or roughly the first year of the Trump administration. It sounds, it's a bleak picture of where we are right now, but I do see some positive indicators that we're, might get a little bit of rationality because accountability maybe starts to seep in. I think that we now have some clearer indications that there'll be more retirements, that there'll be resignations, and that there'll be folks peeling away from Trump, maybe acting as small guardrails, whether it's NATO, European security, this idea of murders on the high seas off of Venezuela. So we might, on the basis of the legislative branch serving as a co-equal branch and conducting oversight, we might start to see some more of that unfold. I think the best case scenario is a decisive win in 2026, and then you start to have a much more rational approach. You'll have a large number of folks being fired, new folks potentially being brought in, and a little bit of an arrest on some of the worst things that have been unfolding over the course of the first year.
So this is an interesting one. On what authority is Jared Kushner participating in the current talks? Not to mention Witkoff, who's a real estate guy, doesn't know anything about Russia or Ukraine.
Yeah, so, it's an interesting question. I have a pretty robust Substack, and I've been writing about this over the course of the past several days and weeks. The only rational reason for Kushner to be there is that he's seen as maybe remotely credible on the work he did around the Abraham Accords. Well overstated. He didn't do nearly as much as he professes to have done. So the real reason is almost certainly the fact that he is part of the Trump Inc. and potentially looking to score some deals with the Russians. I worked with him. He had a portfolio in the first administration. He was a senior advisor and assistant to the president. Put into various different activities. He doesn't have a formal role this time around, so it's very strange. In diplomacy and negotiations, you could have these other paths to try to negotiate with friends and allies. They're called Track 2, which are folks that are not at all involved with government, but maybe check in every now and then. Track 1.5, quasi-governmental negotiations, but those are folks with like a deep expertise, something significant to offer to advance the dialogue. Kushner doesn't have any of that. I think the only reason he's there is because he represents the direct business interests of the Trump family.
Interesting. So regarding Vote Vets, what's the strategy for reaching out to veterans or maybe active duty people who are very conservative? As we know, most of the military is very conservative and very red.
Yeah. So I think it's probably not quite as bleak. I'd say it's about a 60-40, maybe 55-45 makeup. This last go around in November of 2024, it was about a 60-40 split on the military. The 2020 elections, one of the largest swings, I think it was the first or second largest, population swing was amongst veterans. It was a 12-point shift from the preceding election. So veterans are driven by their national security concerns, their values that the president potentially is abandoning America's values, as well as veterans themselves with regards to cost of living issues and VA benefits and stuff like that. So it's definitely a constituency that could be communicated with and moved in a persuasion effort that a campaign might undertake. What we do at Vote Vets is, this organization has been around. Next year will be 20 years. It emerged in 2006 as a validator for the Democrats to be able to offer critical views on national security policy. The thesis was we stumbled into a war of choice in Iraq, and the Democrats actually were happy to sign on to that. And part of the story for that was that they didn't feel comfortable criticizing a national security approach. There was a combination of maybe not enough Democrats in there, but Democrats tend to get beaten up on the fact that they're not strong on national security and defense. So we started this organization well before my time. I only joined them in 22 on this idea of giving veterans a voice in our national security and defense. Over the course of that nearly 20 years, we helped usher in the political careers of scores and scores of candidates. So Tim Walz, when he first ran for Congress, we put $100,000 into his first campaign back in 2006. That allowed him to get a start, and we've been with him since. I mentioned Abigail Spanberger and Mikey Sherrill. Tammy Duckworth has been with us for forever. Ruben Gallego, Alyssa Slotkin, Andy Kim. These are all Vote Vets candidates, superb candidates. So we do advocacy for these folks. So it would be a veteran doing an ad to camera talking about why this is the right choice for the public. So that affects not just the other veterans in the community, but also is an effective way to communicate to a community that respects the veteran's voice. So we do for. We do against veterans that Republican veterans that are challenging our Democrats. So a good example, in this general area, Tester, when he was running, we did the negatives against what's his name? Oh my gosh, it'll come back to me. But we do negatives against candidates that are running, challenging us. And a good example would be the ad we did in New Jersey, where it was a Coast Guardsman talking about, Tax Jack. That he was going to be this was going to be harmful for veterans and for the community. And then we do issue advocacy, and from our work together that would be the Ukraine aid bill is one of the places that we were decisive in helping get the Ukraine aid bill passed about a year and a half ago, or breaking the hold on promotions, beating up the Republicans on their turn away from democracy and towards authoritarianism. So those are the different ways that we engage. And then we have a C3 activity that's, right now it's involved in California with Governor Newsom and helping understand the roles, the limitations, the authorities of the National Guard and active duty force. We're also part of the litigation that's being undertaken. So that's kind of roughly the scope of the organization.
Great. There are a number of high school students in the audience. What would you say to them with regard to them doing advocacy or public service or doing something to ensure their future?
Yeah. I think it's hugely important.
You guys have to look up from your phones when I ask a question about high school students.
They're all, nobody's on their phone. They're doing well. Yeah. So I think, frankly, I think public servants make good people. So it depends on what kind of person you want to be. I'm not sure how many young folks are out there that, want to be out there and killers, making a buck for themselves and not contributing anything to society. That's not the nature of young folks that, look around and want to live fulfilling kind of lives. So look at public service because it's a way to be a good member of the community. In my experience, when I reported Trump's corruption, it was after nearly 20 years of military service. And the idea that, over the course of that 20 years, I was constantly focused on not my own well-being or necessarily my own advancement, but what was the community good or the organizational good. So it allowed me to develop what I think is values muscle memory, kind of just doing the right thing repeatedly. So a career in public service could be extremely rewarding. And we're going to need some of the best and brightest on the back end of this administration to come back in and to help kind of rebuild and not just replace what was lost, but to expand the benefits for more and more Americans. So I think public service is a critical way. I'm so aggressive on this issue that I think we might need to think about what is incentivized or maybe mandatory public service. And I'm not talking about military service. I'm talking about you finish up, high school or college, and you want to get your education paid for. Potentially, you sign up and do national public service, and your school's free. Something of that nature. I think I can think of public service as a path to citizenship for the 10 million or more illegals that engage in public service, and who would not be. I mean, some of us might not be happy, and depending on where you're from. But you were here illegally. You've been a contributing member of society, but then your next step is to engage in public service for the common good of the American people. I think Americans would welcome that with open arms as a path to citizenship. So those types of ideas about public service, I think, would be pretty critical.
Great.
I'm curious, are any questions from the young folks back there? I don't want to put you on the spot, but just think about it for a second. I'd love to take a question from somebody. Not right. Just think about it for a second, and we'll come back.
Normally, I like to ask the last question, but this one's too good, and I'm going to use it as our last question as we're getting short on time. In the video clip, you said, because this is America, and given everything that's happened since you were in that congressional testimony, do you still believe in America? Do you believe we're different? Do you believe our values are going to maintain?
Yeah. It's a tough question sometimes. I think that I did a talk at the University of Washington just a couple weeks back, and I found myself in a situation where it's one of these academic formats where there's a panel of 3 different professors and interrogating my book and some of the thinking. And one of the professors was a proponent for realism, and that I was too harsh on realism, and the other one was a proponent for kind of maybe certainly didn't believe in the idea of that the U.S. could lead from a place of values primacy. And if you're doing what I think amounts to a bit of navel gazing, and you're looking at all the different mistakes that we've made along the way, it looks pretty bleak. But if you look at the sweep of what the U.S. has done, I mean, I don't know how many of you have seen this documentary from Ken Burns about the American Revolution. We basically started the pattern of democratic governments and democracy sprouting around the world. If you take a look at that was in the moment of a horrible moment where we still had large swaths of the American people, whether it's indigenous or black men and women that were left out. But if you look at the U.S. contribution, for instance, in post-World War II, and in the prosperity and elevating the humanity out of the enormous challenges it had, it was the U.S. that played this critical role. So there was something about the population and the consistent values, not the way we see things unfold at the moment, that lends itself to the U.S. in the big arc of history. It bends towards justice. So I think I believe in that. I think my family I came here as a refugee from the Soviet Union. My twin brothers in Congress. We've both been able to contribute, and I think in certain ways, I guess it's part of the American story, American dream. And I think that by my traveling around this country, I see pretty awesome people trying to figure out how they could pitch in and correct course and participate in the system and try to build this more perfect union. So, it could be a bleak picture, and I think a lot of this conversation has been about how the challenges that we have, but I still maintain some optimism. I've got a 14, almost a 15-year-old daughter that I think will navigate these next several years, but she's got a bright future ahead. I think I couldn't conceive of a world in which I'd stop thinking that this is America and here right matters. So, yeah.
On that note, thank you very much. Fabulous.